Have you ever wondered what happens when a child is forced to grow up too quickly? Look around and perhaps you will find this person in the mirror or in someone close to you. That child who was never allowed to be a child, who learned to take care of adults before even learning to take care of themselves, who developed a radar to detect the needs of others while their own needs remained in the background, silenced. This experience, as common as it is invisible, shapes our way of existing in the world in ways we rarely perceive. We carry this inner child, now an adult before its time, in every decision we make, in every relationship we build, in every moment of silence when we finally stop. This is the phenomenon of premature maturation, what Viktor Frankl would recognize as one of the most subtle forms of existential suffering, when our freedom to simply be is compromised by circumstances that force us to assume roles for which we are not yet prepared. However, as Frankl showed us through his own experience in the concentration camps, even in the most adverse conditions, there exists a path to finding meaning. And it is this path that we will explore today, not just as a distant theory, but as a real possibility for transformation for those who had to build their identity on the foundations of premature responsibility. Think of the child who learns to read the facial expressions of an alcoholic father, to know when to get out of the way. The child who prepares dinner for younger siblings while mother works 2 jobs. The child who becomes the emotional confidant of a parent after a painful divorce. These are the children who develop what psychologists call parentification, a process in which there is a reversal of roles and the child assumes responsibilities that normally belong to adults. It is a phenomenon much more common than we imagine, and its consequences extend far beyond childhood, shaping the way we relate to the world, to others, and to ourselves. What makes this experience particularly challenging is that frequently these children are praised for their mature behavior, for their ability to care for others, for their independence. They receive labels such as little adult, so responsible, my right hand. And these compliments, though well-intentioned, reinforce the idea that their value is intrinsically linked to their usefulness, their capacity to care, to solve problems, to be strong. This message, repeated throughout the formative years, transforms into an internal voice that many carry into adulthood. A voice that says, if I am not taking care of someone, if I am not being useful, then who am I? What is my value? Viktor Frankl, with his extraordinary ability to observe human patterns even in the most extreme conditions, offers us a unique perspective on this phenomenon. In his writings and in his clinical practice as the founder of logotherapy, Frankl identified that many of his patients suffered not only from specific traumas, but from a crisis of meaning, an absence of meaning that is particularly acute in those who grew up with an identity built around caring for others. For Frankl, the existential vacuum, this feeling of lack of purpose, can be even deeper for those who never had the opportunity to discover who they are beyond their roles as caretakers. The child who had to be an adult often becomes an adult who does not know how to simply be human, with needs, desires, limitations, and dreams of their own. It is as if they had learned the language of others perfectly, but remained illiterate in their own inner language. I want to pause here and ask, do you recognize yourself in this description? Can you identify moments in your life when you had to assume responsibilities far beyond your age? I know it can be difficult to put into words experiences that may never have been validated as significant or even as forms of suffering. Many of us were taught to minimize these experiences, to say, but other people went through much worse things, or this made me who I am today. And while there is truth in these statements, they can also prevent us from recognizing and processing the real impact these experiences have had on our formation. When you share your story here, you are not only processing your own experience, but also reaching out to thousands of people who carry similar stories and feel deeply alone in this journey. If you wish, start your comment with, I had to be an adult when, and let your words find their own path. There is no right or wrong way to express your truth. What happens when a child is forced to assume adult roles prematurely? The psychological consequences are profound and often remain invisible even to the person experiencing them. First, a state of hypervigilance develops, where the child is constantly alert to the emotional environment around them, looking for signs of danger, need, or instability. This hypervigilance, although adaptive in childhood, frequently persists into adulthood, manifesting as chronic anxiety, difficulty relaxing, or a constant feeling that something bad is about to happen. There is also the development of what psychologists call the false self, a personality constructed not from the child's authentic and natural impulses, but from the perceived needs of the environment. The child learns to be who they need to be, to survive emotionally, not who they naturally are. Another common consequence is the development of relational patterns based on unilateral care. The person who is parentified frequently reproduces this pattern in their adult relationships, assuming the role of caretaker, problem solver, the person everyone can rely on. There is a profound difficulty in receiving, in allowing oneself to be vulnerable, in admitting needs. It is as if the muscle of giving were hyperdeveloped, while the muscle of receiving remained atrophied. This leads to unbalanced relationships, where there is a dynamic of over-responsibility on one side and under-responsibility on the other. And eventually, it leads to exhaustion, physical and emotional. The body finally communicates what the mind was trained to ignore, that no one can continuously give without receiving, that no one is unlimited in their capacity to care for others. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of this phenomenon is the distorted relationship with one's own needs and emotions. The parentified child learns early on that their needs are secondary, that there is no space for their emotions, especially difficult ones like anger, sadness, or fear. They learn to suppress these emotions, to rationalize them, to consider them as irrelevant or even selfish. The result is an adult who frequently feels disconnected from themselves, who has difficulty identifying what they truly feel, what they truly desire. An adult who may be extremely successful in navigating the emotional complexities of others, but who feels lost when trying to navigate their own internal emotional landscape. Viktor Frankl would observe that in this pattern there also exists a profound crisis of meaning. The child who is forced to assume adult responsibilities often develops an identity based on utility, on the ability to solve problems, to be strong for others. When this identity is shaken, when for some reason the person can no longer perform this role, an existential crisis emerges. Who am I if I am not useful? What is my value if I am not taking care of someone? Frankl called this condition the existential vacuum, a deep feeling of lack of purpose and meaning. And although this feeling can be experienced by anyone, it is particularly acute for those whose identity was built around caring for others. However, it is precisely at this point of crisis that logotherapy, the therapeutic approach developed by Frankl, offers a transformative perspective. Because for Frankl, suffering is not just something to be eliminated or avoided at all costs. Suffering, when faced with an attitude of openness and search for meaning, can become the catalyst for profound and authentic growth. Frankl observed this in his own experience in the Nazi concentration camps, where he witnessed how some people, even in the most extreme conditions of deprivation and suffering, managed to maintain an attitude of dignity and purpose, not because they denied the suffering, but because they found a greater meaning that transcended the immediate circumstances. For the person who grew up having to be an adult prematurely, the perspective of logotherapy offers a path of reconciliation with this history. It is not about denying the impact of these experiences or minimizing the injustice of having lost aspects of childhood that should be the right of every child. It is about recognizing that even in this experience, there exists the possibility of finding meaning, of transforming suffering into a human achievement. Frankl identified that the human being is fundamentally motivated by a will to meaning, a search for meaning that transcends the simple search for pleasure or power. And it is in this search for meaning that we find our true freedom, our ability to choose our attitude in the face of circumstances, even when we cannot change the circumstances themselves. One of the most powerful concepts of logotherapy is what Frankl called self-distancing, the unique human capacity to observe oneself, to create a space between stimulus and response. It is this capacity that allows us to look at our patterns, our stories, our wounds, not as something that completely defines us, but as something we can observe, understand, and eventually transform. For the person who grew up having to be an adult prematurely, this concept offers a liberating perspective. It means that Although these experiences have profoundly shaped their way of being in the world, they do not completely determine who they are or who they can become. There exists a space of freedom, a space where you can begin to recognize these patterns, to honor the child who had to grow up too quickly, and to make conscious choices about how you want to live from here on out. Another fundamental concept in Frankl's approach is self-transcendence, the idea that we find meaning not by looking directly at ourselves, but by directing our attention to something or someone beyond ourselves. It is a profound paradox. The more we focus exclusively on our own happiness or self-realization, the more this happiness escapes us. It is when we forget ourselves, when we dedicate ourselves to a greater cause, to a meaningful relationship, to work that contributes to the world, that we find, as a side effect, a sense of purpose and fullness. For the person who grew up having to care for others, this represents a subtle but profound transformation, moving from care based on obligation, fear, or guilt, to care based on conscious choice, love, and authentic connection. Frankl identified three main ways through which we can find meaning: through what we create or accomplish, through what we experience or encounter in the world, and through the attitude we choose in the face of inevitable suffering. For the person who grew up having to be an adult prematurely, these three paths offer concrete ways to a more full and meaningful life. Through creation and accomplishment, they can rediscover parts of themselves that were suppressed or neglected, talents and interests that did not have space to flourish, while all energies were directed towards survival and caring for others. Through experience and encounter, they can learn to be present in new ways, to receive as well as give, to allow themselves to experience beauty, connection, and love without the constant filter of vigilance and responsibility. And through the attitude towards inevitable suffering, they can transform even their most painful experiences into sources of wisdom, compassion, and growth. A powerful example of this transformation can be found in Frankl's own story. As a prisoner in the concentration camps, he observed that even in the most extreme conditions of deprivation and suffering, people still had the freedom to choose their attitude, to maintain their inner dignity, to find small moments of meaning and beauty. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, he describes how even in the camp there were prisoners who walked through the barracks offering others a piece of bread, a word of comfort, not because they had more than others, but because they had chosen to respond to suffering not with bitterness or despair, but with compassion and humanity. This ability to choose our attitude, even in the most limited circumstances, is what Frankl called the last of human freedoms, and is one of the most powerful messages of logotherapy. To apply the principles of logotherapy to the experience of having grown up as a child who had to be an adult, we can consider several practical approaches. The first is what Frankl called paradoxical intention, a therapeutic technique that involves directly confronting our fears instead of trying to avoid them. For the person who grew up with a deep fear of not being enough, of failing in their responsibilities, of disappointing others, this technique may involve deliberately allowing themselves to be imperfect, to make mistakes, to set boundaries, to say no. It is through this direct confrontation with fear that we discover that what we most fear often loses its power over us when we face it directly. Another practical approach is what we might call rediscovering play, recovering aspects of childhood that were lost or suppressed. This does not mean denying adult reality or present responsibilities, but rather integrating qualities such as spontaneity, curiosity, joy, and presence that are natural in childhood and which are often sacrificed in the process of premature maturation. It may mean allowing oneself to explore activities without a productive purpose, just for the pleasure of the experience. It may mean rediscovering interests and passions that were abandoned because they did not seem useful or necessary. It may mean learning to play not just as a separate activity, but as a quality that permeates all of life, bringing lightness even to the most serious and responsible tasks. A third practical path is the development of what we might call retroactive compassion, the ability to look at the child we were with, understanding, acceptance, and love. Many people who had to assume adult roles prematurely carry a sense of shame or inadequacy, as if they had somehow never done enough, as if they had failed in their impossible responsibilities. Developing compassion for this child who did the best they could with extremely limited resources is a crucial step in the journey of healing. It is not about denying the reality of what happened or idealizing the past, but about recognizing the courage, resilience, and humanity of the child who survived in circumstances that no child should have to face. Their fourth practical element is what Frankl would call attitude modulation, the conscious practice of choosing our stance in the face of circumstances. For the person who grew up having to be hyper-vigilant and hyper-responsible, this may mean deliberately practicing letting go of control, allowing oneself to be vulnerable, to receive help, to trust others. It may mean recognizing when old patterns of self-deprivation and self-sacrifice are activated and making a conscious choice to respond differently. Not because these patterns are intrinsically wrong, but because now, as adults, we have the freedom to choose when to give and when to receive, when to assume responsibility and when to allow others to assume their part, when to care and when to be cared for. Finally, one of the most powerful paths to transformation is what Frankl called self-transcendence, the ability to direct our attention to something beyond ourselves. For the person who grew up having to be an adult prematurely, this can take a particularly meaningful form, transforming their own experience of suffering into a source of compassion and wisdom that benefits others. Not through self-sacrifice or denial of one's own needs, but through a mature integration of the experience, where suffering is not wasted, but transformed into something that can illuminate the path for others. This can happen in countless ways, through work that directly helps others in similar situations, through art that gives voice to experiences that are rarely recognized, through relationships where our deep understanding of human pain allows us to be present for others in authentic and healing ways. What all these approaches have in common is a movement from passivity to activity, from being defined by circumstances to consciously choosing our response to them. It is this movement that is at the heart of logotherapy and that offers a path of transformation for those who had to assume adult responsibilities prematurely. It is not about denying or minimizing the impact of these experiences, but about recognizing that, as Frankl said, everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. Returning to the image we began with, of the child who had to grow up too quickly, we can now see it with new eyes. Not just as a victim of unjust circumstances, although there is certainly truth in this perspective, but also as a bearer of extraordinary resilience, a capacity to find inner resources even in the most challenging situations. And we can see the adult this child became not as someone irredeemably marked by the past, but as someone who, through the conscious search for meaning, can transform even their most painful experiences into sources of wisdom, compassion, and purpose. As Frankl showed us through his own life and work, it is not the circumstances themselves that determine our destiny, but the way we respond to them. The child who had to be an adult prematurely carries wounds, yes, but also carries a unique capacity to understand human fragility, to recognize courage in small daily choices, to find beauty even in unlikely places. And it is perhaps in this capacity that we find the deepest meaning, the transformation of personal suffering into a wisdom that illuminates not only our own life, but also the lives of those around us. If these reflections touch something inside you, something that perhaps was dormant or nameless until now, I want to invite you to continue this journey with me. By subscribing to this channel, you are not just receiving more videos, you are connecting to a space where we explore together how to find meaning even in the most challenging moments of life. As Frankl taught us, it is precisely in the search for meaning that we find our true strength. Join us in this search, activate the notification bell, and let us build, reflection by reflection, a life worth living not despite suffering, but through it.